Now, as we look back to 2008, the number of issues economically the U.S. has faced has been significant. And that economic challenge that began in 2008 then spread to the global economy, and in turn, a significant impact with the EU and all the challenges in the EU. With all of these events happening, it raises several interesting questions for us. Number one, is the U.S. poised to recover economically, or is the experience we're having today part of a longer-term, broader economic decline? A second issue is China. What's happening in China, the growth in China, and how will that growth in China affect the growth in the U.S., the growth in Europe, and in other nations? A third issue is what could have been done to prevent the current situation that we're in? And a related question to that is, what is the right balance between business and government in setting up an environment where there can be long-term sustainable growth? The final issue is, what should we do from here? If we're in the U.S., what should we do from here in terms of driving the economic growth? We've got two great speakers to cover these issues and other related issues. First speaker is going to be Ed Luce. Ed has recently released his book, which is Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent. Ed is the senior bureau chief and commentator for the Financial Times in the U.S. and writes a weekly column about the U.S. economy, politics, and foreign policy. He was previously the South Asia bureau chief for the Financial Times based in New Delhi. And in between 1999 and 2001, he was a speechwriter for Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. Our next speaker after that will be David Rothkopf. He's here to discuss his recent book, Power, Inc., The Epic Rivalry Between Big Business and Government and the Reckoning That Lies Ahead. Mr. Rothkopf is a visiting scholar in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's also the president and CEO of Garden Rothkopf, an international advisory firm. He's also the editor-in-chief and CEO of Foreign Policy magazine, and prior to all of that, he was the managing director for Kissinger Associates. Please let's welcome both of our speakers and have Ed join us to begin with.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Just quickly to clarify that I was Larry's speechwriter only when he was Treasury Secretary, not when he was president of Harvard. It's immensely kind of you to have invited me. It happens to coincide, I know it wasn't prompted by, happens to coincide with my book launch, as you mentioned, which is next week, which is next Tuesday. I'm also very, very privileged to be sharing the podium with David Rothkopf, whose book was launched 3 or 4 weeks ago. I've had the good fortune to have read David's book twice now, once in galley form and once in finished form. And for anybody who's remotely interested in the breadth and depth of the subject that we have before us today, I would strongly urge them to read David's book. In this age of 140-character Twitter-length thinking, this is the perfect antidote. It reminds us of why you need history, context, depth to address these kinds of subjects. A couple of caveats about what I'm about to say. The first is that in spite of what many people very kindly recommended I do with this book, Time to Start Thinking, America in the Age of Dissent, I haven't given it a Hollywood ending. It would just simply betray I think whatever integrity I have or whatever integrity the book has, to give out false saccharine conclusions that simply aren't merited by the premise of my book. And it is a fairly bleak analysis of the trajectory that America is on. So I thought I'd give you that health warning. And the other caveat I'd like to give is that, as you will by now have already worked out, that I am marketing this book in the wrong accent, a British one, an English one, and I do appreciate that can sometimes rub people up the wrong way. Just the other day I came across a quote from Samuel Huntington from the late 80s, who was responding to Paul Kennedy's famous declinist book of that time, and Huntington defined what he meant by American declinist. And his definition was not just somebody who's foreseeing or seeing America's decline, but somebody who wishes for America's decline. And so I'd like to make it very, very clear that under that definition, I am not a declinist. I do not take any pleasure in the kind of analysis I'm about to very briefly summarize for you. In a way, if one way of putting it is that I'm, I suppose, attempting to give a very sharp slap around the face to a very good friend who happens to be sleepwalking. And I think that's a reasonable description of the direction, at least the political direction America is taking at the moment. What do we mean by decline? Well, I mean, the first and the most, I think, uncontroversial definition of decline is relative economic decline. If you look at America's share of the world economy, it's been going down quite steadily in the last 30 years, but slowly. In 1970, the US accounted for 36% of the world economy. By 2000, it was down to about 31% of the world economy, all of which was good news. Americans were richer, others were getting less poor. Economics isn't a zero-sum game. The markets for American products and expertise and intellectual capital is expanding. But in the last decade, between 2001 and 2011, America's share of the world economy has dropped from 31% to 23.5%. China's having risen commensurately, and other BRIC countries. And if we see a continuation of this trend, and I think nothing barring a cataclysm that sort of shuts the BRIC countries down is going to prevent a continuation of this trend, then America is going to go today from just under about a quarter of the world economy to, by 2020, roughly a sixth of the world economy. And that's a very, very different proposition to where we were at the beginning of this century, a few short years ago, where the US had a third. So that relatively uncontroversial definition of decline, relative economic decline, I don't think there's any very serious dispute that it's happening. And there shouldn't necessarily be any serious concern about the fact that it's happening. It is a belated entrance onto the world stage of the vast majority of the world's population that didn't form a part of the West and that didn't take part in the 18th, 19th century industrial revolutions and that were largely, by and large, colonized by the West. We should be celebrating the economic progress and indeed the often political progress that comes with it in that 85% of the world that is not defined as the West. But there are other definitions, more subjective definitions of decline, which I'd like to just explore a little bit in the next few minutes, that are to do with the attractiveness of the American model, of America as a beacon for the world, not just the world economy, but for the world's wannabe Democrats, for the world's human rights activists, of America as a place to emulate. And I think this more subjective definition of decline, under this more subjective definition, America is also in decline, because this relative economic decline that I started out with is being exacerbated and is being deepened by a series of self-inflicted wounds, primarily through the American political system, that is failing to address the deep underlying structural challenges posed by globalization, posed by an increasingly exponentially automating technology that affects the way we live and work, and that is producing a stasis, a paralysis, a gridlock in the political system that is very, very deeply rooted. And this, I think, is linked very directly to some of the pessimism I'm conveying, because it's hard to see how quickly the political system is going to get out of this. Now, let me just give you three very brief illustrations, most of which, perhaps all of which, you'll be familiar with. The first is I think, the most important barometer, not just of an economy's health, but of a democracy's health, and that is the condition of the middle class. The American middle class is not in good condition. As you know, before the 2007 Great Recession began and the 2008 financial collapse then deepened it into a potential depression, the middle class was already either treading water and in some respects losing its real income growth. But between 1973 and 2007, the median American household essentially registered no income gains at all. Now, there were actually slight income gains, all of them, during the 1990s, but they were lost during the 2002 to 2007 business cycle, the first business cycle in modern history where the vast preponderance of American people were poorer at the end of it in real terms than they were at the beginning. Well, we've had a change of political leadership since then. We've, of course, got the Obama administration replacing the Bush administration, and we've had a change of economic priorities. Nevertheless, in spite of what the Obama administration has done and tried to do, the median income of the median American household has fallen in the 2 years since the Great Recession has ended. Between 2009 and 2011, median household income has gone down 6.7%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That is having already gone down by an equivalent amount during the recession itself. In other words, since the recession ended, we've had 2 recessions worth of income decline. That's since the recession ended, and that can't be underlined enough. Now, the condition of the middle class, about which I and many, many others can wax very lyrical, so I won't go on about this too much longer, is linked, I think, inextricably in a negative feedback loop with the condition of American politics. I think that there is a very clear parallel, but also a causal relationship between the bifurcating economy and the polarizing political scene. Thinkers from left to right, whether you're talking about Bill Bishop, whose excellent book, The Big Sort, chronicles how Americans are dividing themselves into like-minded communities, right to the other end, or at least a very different end of the political spectrum, to Charles Murray, whose latest book looks at the cognitive elite that is breaking off from the rest of the American society in its super zip codes, which are surrounded by slightly less super zip codes and so on. That people are basically in American society dividing themselves by where they live, not just by what they read or who they talk to, or the habits they form, but by where they live, into different universes from other Americans. And this is very much reflecting itself in the politics in Washington. I'm not going to rehearse, because I think you're a very educated audience, and I'm sure highly as much news junkies as I am, or I hope you don't waste as much time on Twitter as I do. So I'm not going to rehearse the problems with Washington. I think we're all very familiar with just how polarized it is and with just how difficult it is to take basic pragmatic steps to reverse some of these structural economic problems in the American economy. But what I will say is this, that whenever I make an argument to people that America is in trouble and that it needs to wake up, essentially, they respond by saying, look, whatever happens in Washington, or however bad things look in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or Gary, Indiana, or in Flint, Michigan, we have got Silicon Valley. We have got the most impressive system of innovation and of commercialization of invention in the world, and indeed that the world has ever known. And this is undoubtedly true. This is the golden goose of the American economy. And it has been laying golden eggs of a size no other economy is capable of laying. But I would caution, and double underline my caution, about any assumption that this will continue unbroken with a political economy in the condition that it's in. I don't think, to stray into jargon for a second, that the health of Silicon Valley, or more broadly the American innovative ecosystem, is unrelated to the condition of America's political economy. Indeed, there are signs, very clear numerical signs, that the startup rate of businesses, the level of entrepreneurialism in the US, has fallen very sharply in the last decade. Here, under your noses in Silicon Valley, the amount of money being raised by the venture capital sector is still only at about 10 to 15% annually of where it was in the late 90s. Now, you might respond correctly to some degree that the late 90s was a bubble. There was a ridiculous amount of pets.com fundraising going on, and so some of this was a necessary correction. I think that's right. Sorry, am I about to run out of time? Just another minute. But I would suggest there are other reasons for this as well, more deep-seated secular reasons, that other countries are becoming more entrepreneurial. Other countries are changing their governance system to attract research and development, to attract entrepreneurs, to attract PhDs educated here in America, no longer getting visas to stay in America. Other countries are growing. It's not just that you've 9/11ized your immigration system for the highly skilled. It's that there are opportunities elsewhere in the world that are attracting the talent, that are attracting the IQ. If you look at Sequoia Capital, one of your biggest VC firms in Sand Hill Road, it has 8 offices in the world, 7 of which now are outside of America. I think that's a trend that you'll see mapped more broadly across the innovative ecosystem in the United States. A final point. Actually, no, I won't make the final point because it'll go on for 3 or 4 minutes. What I'll try and do is secrete it into the question and answer session. But anyway, that's the Hollywood ending that I could come up with. I'll try better during the answers. Thank you. Sorry, was that 15 minutes?
Perfect. That's perfect.
Was that 15?
It was 15.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. I would say it is a pleasure to follow Ed, but it's not. He was very good. He was absolutely right, and I don't know how to top it. That's why I'm glad my book came out 3 weeks before his did. Having said that, I've also read his book twice, just in case you think he has a leg up on me. He read mine twice in order to try and figure out what I was saying. I read his twice because it's worth reading twice. Ed's book is better than smart. It's right. And it's reported. It's not just opinion. And if you read it, even if you're the booster of all boosters, you're going to stop and think there are things broken in this system. Now, stopping and thinking about what's broken in the system is what led me to write my book in the first place. I think there's an interesting juxtaposition here for those of you who aren't noting it. Ed and I both served in the Clinton administration. I served in the Commerce Department. Ed served in the Treasury Department. So there we were in economic agencies at the vanguard of a big expansion and also a political movement that continued the Reagan themes of deregulation, of leaving it to the markets, of opening things up, of pursuing free trade, because we thought that was the engine of growth, and we thought that if we left it to the markets would take care of things, because we had bought into a line of cant that had been handed down for a number of decades. And it may not have been perfectly clear when we left, but 10 years later, looking back on the decade, it was not only a decade of foreign policy calamity for the United States, But as Ed indicated, the last decade was the first decade in American history in which we had net job loss. It was a decade in which median incomes went down. It was also a decade in which social mobility declined and inequality grew. Now you have to ask yourself, how did we get into a situation like this? A situation which, as Ed points out in his excellent piece in today's Financial Times, which summarizes some of the key points from the book, that in last year's recovery, 93% of the benefits of the recovery went to the top 1% of the population, and the remaining 7%, table scraps, went to the rest of us. That's a problem. No one can deny that. The question is, what is it a symptom of? Is it a symptom of something in the moment? Something that's just about the rise of other economies? Or is it a symptom of something deeper? And the goal I had when I went and I did this book was to go back and to say, what of the problems that we're seeing now, what of the apparent imbalances in our society are actually rooted in longer-term historical trends? Now, I've been very fortunate with this book. Sold more copies than my other books. It's got a nice cover. It stands out in bookstores. It's gotten a bunch of good reviews. I've been been on a couple of bestseller lists. But a couple reviews from stupid people have said the beginning part of this book is about history. It's for history buffs. I'm not a history buff. Folks, I'm a history buff. I like this stuff. But even if you're not, eat your vegetables. Okay? If you don't go and look at the roots of this, you are not going to understand that the problems that we are addressing are not momentary problems. Every generation has a particular psychological disorder, which I call temporal narcissism. Okay, we all think we live at the moment. We figured it out. Our moment is the most special of all moments. That's why when people get old like Ed, they start writing about decline. It's not their decline. It's that surely when we're gone, things are going to get worse. Now, having said that, if you go back, and I went back 1,000 years. In fact, I went back 1,000 years into the dark history of Sweden where there was a goat. I don't think you figured there was going to be a goat in this story, but there was a goat who wandered away from a goat herd, came back, and he had red horns. And the goat herd said, "Where did the red horns come from?" And he followed him along the way, and he found a stream full of red, cloudy liquid. And beneath that stream, he found copper. And he started digging, and he dug copper out of what later became known as the Great Copper Mountain in Sweden, which became the biggest business in Sweden. The Swedish Empire, there was a Swedish Empire. In fact, history turned on this empire, was built on this copper mountain. And the company that was created from that copper mountain is the oldest corporation still in existence in the world today. It's now called Stora Enso. It was called Stora Kopparberg, which means Great Copper Mountain, by the way. And that little tiny company that you've never heard of is one of 2,000 companies in the world today that are bigger than most countries in the world today. That little company controlled more land than the government of Qatar, about half the land of Belgium. It's got more revenue than 70 or 80 countries have GDP. And there are 2,000 companies in the world bigger than it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Having big companies, having markets grow, creates jobs. But what happens when power gets concentrated in the hands of a few people, and they can start reshaping the system, as corporations have done over the course of the past several hundred years, is that fundamental democratic ideas get undone. We've seen that in the United States. You've heard of Citizens United. Citizens United was the worst decision by the United States Supreme Court since the Dred Scott case. Essentially, it took a fundamental precept of democracy, one man or one person and one vote, and turned it on its head and said a fundamental right that is given to every person, speech, is actually redistributable. If money equals speech, as the decision argues, then those with more money have more speech. Those with more money have more influence. And that's what's happened in American democracy, is that over the course of the past couple of hundred years, we have built a system of law that has increasingly transferred power from people to artificial people. Because that's what corporations are. And when corporations started 1,000 years ago, it was very clear. They were chartered by states to serve states. But over time, what happened was, because they could live forever, because they could accrue more power, because people could benefit from associating with them, politicians, for example, laws got changed slightly. If you go back to the beginning of the 18th century, there was something called the South Sea Island Bubble in England. And by the way, having an Englishman talk about countries in decline is... As he just said, he knows what he's talking about. But you can trace some of that decline to some of these problems infecting them before they affected us. The South Sea Island Bubble was a bubble like the bubble we just went through. What happened? There was some real estate in the South Pacific. People thought that they could make a lot of money on it. They put their money into it. They went bust, and the Parliament bailed them out. And if you took English newspapers of the day, for which Ed's forebears no doubt wrote, and if you took, or were written about, if you took English newspapers of the day, you will read editorial after editorial that sounds just like they were ripped out of the pages of today's Wall Street Journal, or perhaps a paper with a better editorial page. The problem was so great that in the United States, those writings had an influence on people. And Thomas Jefferson, at the time he was writing the Declaration of Independence, was urging that the writings about this concentration of power be put in the library at the University of Virginia that he founded it. And Thomas Jefferson wrote that he worried that too much concentration of power in the hands of corporations would undo American democracy. And he wasn't the only one. Abraham Lincoln wrote the same thing. Theodore Roosevelt wrote the same thing. Justice Brandeis wrote the same thing. Woodrow Wilson wrote the same thing. Franklin Roosevelt wrote the same thing. Over that time, the power got more and more concentrated. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution was designed to guarantee equal protection under the law to people. In the first 50 years of its existence, the vast majority of cases brought before the Supreme Court were for corporations. They won the rights of people. Now the Supreme Court has already ruled more than half of the articles in the Bill of Rights, those rights are guaranteed to corporations too. But see, corporations don't just have those rights. They live forever. That's why they exist. They concentrate power. And markets, which we say create efficiency, markets which we say create opportunity, don't just create opportunity. They seek efficiency. And efficiency comes from scale. So the bigger the company is, the more likely they are to succeed, the more concentrated wealth they have, the more influence that they've got. Now, I've only got a couple more minutes, so I want to cut to a core conclusion that comes from all of this. And we can talk about other conclusions as we go. But it ties into Ed's point, and I think it becomes a useful place where we can jump off into your questions. And that is that what has happened here is that the American system has gotten into imbalance, and we are suffering not just as a people, but in the eyes of the world. And I spoke to a senior official in the Obama administration, and he said to me that he was talking to Chinese leadership, and the Chinese leader said that they felt they had won the financial crisis. And I thought, wow, that's kind of a strange thing. What do they mean they won? Well, we were distracted. But also, we lost face. We lost prestige in the debate because our system, which was vaunted before the world, it was held up to the world as an example, is now seen as an engine of inequality, as a creator of concentrated wealth. Ed's article in the paper says the family that owns Walmart holds between themselves more wealth than the bottom 150 million people in the United States of America. The rest of the world doesn't want that. We thought we had won, at the end of the Cold War, the biggest battle in history. In fact, Francis Fukuyama went out, he wrote about the end of history. We were there. This is that temporal narcissism. We'd figured it out. The liberal democracy is it. This is the way it was going to go on, except for one thing. It wasn't that capitalism had defeated communism and the rivalry was over. Instead, we had entered a world of a different kind of competition, a competition among capitalisms. And that's the reality we face today. We have American capitalism, which is struggling, but we have capitalism with Chinese characteristics, which is a little bit of statism, but it's not state capitalism like you're told it is, which is a stalking horse designed to make you think that the only choice was between government-dominated top-down rule and free markets, which are there for all of us. No, China's a mix. There's a state role, and in some places in China the problem is that there's not enough of a state role. Okay, but so you've got capitalism with Chinese characteristics. You've got democratic development capitalism in big countries like Brazil and India that have important social contracts there. You've got European capitalism, which is different, by the way, in Southern Europe than it is in Northern Europe. I mean, Europe is a hot topic these days. Mitt Romney obviously had a bad experience in Europe. I have a feeling that when Mitt Romney slams his hand in a car door, the word that comes out of his mouth is Europe. But it would do us well to note that in Southern Europe, while things aren't going so well, in Northern Europe, you've got economies that are rated higher than us time after time in quality of life, higher than us in quality of education, higher than us in infrastructure, higher than us in R&D spending, and these economies, including the little Swedish one there, rank higher than us in fiscal responsibility also. These are not free-spending, wacky socialist economies. They're people with a different balance. And that's the point that I'm trying to get at. You've even got small other economies like Singapore, Israel, the UAE, little states that are entrepreneurial, that operate almost like companies. But they all differ from us in one key respect. In their balance, there's a bigger role for government, more of a voice for people at the table. And it's providing people with that seat at the table that is so crucial in counterbalancing this power. We can't do without one side or without the other. But the lesson of history, the lesson of Ed's book, the lesson of this discussion is that when the system gets out of balance, the vast majority of people end up suffering. I look forward to taking your questions.
It's a good speech.
So let me first just start and say thanks for thoughtful and provocative comments to start out our session. What I'd like to do is first talk a bit more in detail about the problem we're dealing with here, the context, the history, et cetera. And then I'd like to get into then, what do you do? What are the recommendations going forward? And Ed, I'm going to start with you because I feel bad for you because you're getting older. You're from a nation in decline, a lot of other things. So I'm going to give you the first...
The decline already
happened. Yes, it already happened. Past tense decline. So you've got an interesting section in your book about parallels from the UK, about decline of Britain, what happened there, et cetera. Be interested in getting your view about what is analogous, what isn't, and then maybe David get to you about other nations potentially. Where can we learn from nations that have managed similar situations that have slowed the rate of decline, potentially reversed it, and where do we just not see it? And there's a sense of inevitability in what situation we're in.
Mm-hmm. I'm certainly not saying that America's future is in Britain's past. I think they're two very different countries. America is not an imperialist country, at least in the conventional sense. And the British imperial role was disproportionate to its size, both geographically and in terms of population. America is never going to become the 10th largest economy in the world. It's always going to be in the top 2 or 3. So, it's not going to be as steep a descent. But David, I think, made a very powerful, eloquent case for an historical perspective. And if there is one I'd like to pick, it's actually taken directly from a little-known but very good book called The Weary Titan by an American scholar called Aaron Friedberg, who was then, I think, at Harvard. In fact, this was his PhD thesis written in the late 80s. And he looks at Britain between 1895 and 1905 at the stage where, without the benefit of the quarterly statistics we now diet on, it was gradually dawning on Britain's elites, on the British establishment, that Bismarck's Germany, on the one hand, and the United States across the Atlantic were overtaking Britain, not just in terms of their scale and their size, but in terms of their ability to innovate. The metallurgy, the chemicals industry, etc., that was coming out of Germany at the time, and of course, electrification of America, the internal combustion engine, it was all becoming pretty obvious. And so there was this big debate in Britain between two schools. One school, led by the Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, said we have to keep our unilaterally open market free trade system that we have had since the 1840s, since the Corn Laws were abolished, that others have not followed. Lincoln put up tariff rates, average bound tariff rates in America to 50%, and they stayed that way until the early 20s, when they were lowered temporarily, rapidly to be reversed by Smoot-Hawley, as you remember. So America has only had an open regime since the Second World War, and I think people forget that. You rose in the way China is rising now. And that's a very important point. Then on the other hand, there were the free traders. And on the other hand, there were what were called the Little Englanders, who wanted to set up vast protectionist barriers, an imperial preference system that would encompass Canada, Australia, India, etc. I don't think they were going to be asked whether they wanted to be a part of this, but they were going to be behind this fortress that would mimic Bismarckian Germany's trade policy, and indeed Teddy Roosevelt's America. And the latter lost, I think, thankfully. But the debate is absolutely fascinating, because it's the same debate we're having in America today. Should we emulate the vocational schools they have in Germany? Should we emulate the strong state R&D system that they have in America, that they're developing in America, taken from Germany? Should we revitalize our education system, which is turning us into a lot of gentlemanly liberal arts people? Should we worry about the fact we don't make things anymore? That we have a conceit that we use the brain. These other people are using the hand. And the free traders won. Now, Britain was very fortunate in the fact that it had America to take over from it, that it had a like-minded, friendly nation to hand the baton onto. I think that's the big difference between America today and Britain then, because clearly countries like China are not like-minded, and we can't take it for granted that history is ending and that they are going to become like-minded. And that is really the context in which I'm deeply alarmed about the lack of what I would call acute analytic deficiency syndrome in the American political classes. That I don't think there's enough awareness of the situation America is in and is heading into. So that's the brief history lesson.
Mm-hmm. Good. David?
You would call acute analytical deficiency syndrome a society in which one political party is against science, math, and history?
Well, that's well put.
I'm shocked. You asked about whether there were analogous situations, and I mean, you have to go back and look for the biggest countries in history and how they've grappled with this. And clearly the immediate predecessor was the British Empire, and Ed's just talked about that with some eloquence. So let me approach this from a slightly different angle, which is to say, I think it's curious that we have a debate in the United States, a political debate in which both sides are regularly coming back to the absolute criticality of America being number one. You know, that and you hear it, the president in his State of the Union address, Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, all these other characters out there. We must be number one. We can't let the Chinese overtake us. As if number one was, defined, every aspect of a society. Some of these countries that you're talking about that were once great empires and no longer are have an advantage over us. They've stopped having this kind of idiotic argument about whether they should be number one or not. And they're having a discussion in their society not about whether they want to be the top, but what they want to be the top at. Why are we organized as a society? There seems to be an assumption in an American society that the reason we are organized is to have the largest GDP in the world. Okay, even though during the past decade, GDP went up and all these bad things happened to us. GDP is an average measure. It's a bad measure. It doesn't cover a lot of things that go on within an economy. There are other measures that are more important. Quality of life, happiness, health, education, justice, opportunity. And on all of these other measures, it's strange, but a lot of the people who are touting us being number one are ignoring the fact that we're falling in these other measures. I don't really care how big America's economy is relative to every other economy. I care that the American economy that my daughters are entering into now creates more opportunity for them than it did for me, than it did for my parents. That was the American dream. That was the promise that was handed to all of us. And the stark reality presented in Ed's book and in every day's newspaper is that's not the reality in America anymore. Because social mobility is going. If you're born in the bottom fifth, you're stuck in the bottom fifth. If you are a minority born in an inner city, the odds are higher than not that you will drop out of school before you graduate high school. How are you going to compete with a kid who's going to school in Shanghai, who, by the way, doesn't have an educational system that's built on a 19th century agrarian calendar giving him the summer off? Doesn't have an educational system that has him going to school 6 hours a day, doesn't have a teachers union saying you can't have a national curriculum, can't take advantage of technology to get the best minds into every classroom in America. Those 55%, the majority of minority students in inner cities, they're done. They are out of the competitive race. That's not a statistic. That's a social catastrophe for the United States of America. And that's the kind of thing we ought to be directing ourselves to, rather than saber-rattling, boosterism, jingoism, wrapping ourselves in the flag and talking about how we're going to always be bigger than everybody else, just like we always have been.
Let me... Let's talk a little bit more now about China. I think, Ed, you started to bring that up about the developments in China and where are those helpful because there's strong domestic growth there that has created some global growth, where the quote-unquote threat exists. One of our questioner asks about the effects of the yuan potentially becoming the world's reserve currency. How should we think about China? It's for both of you.
I was recently in China, in fact, a couple of weeks ago. Every year, the Financial Times holds an annual, what they call the Great Debates, that coincide with the annual literary festivals, back-to-back literary festivals in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong. And we hold a fairly Oxbridgey, flippant kind of debate, which I was naturally selected for. And the motion this year was China's rise comes at America's expense, and I was required to argue for that motion, along with my colleague Gideon Rachman. And the way you win the debate, the audiences were strongly Chinese, overwhelmingly Chinese, although there's some expatriates. The way you win the debate is you take a vote at the beginning, who agrees with the motion. And if at the end you've shifted the needle at all, you win. And so at the beginning of the debates, we started, I think, about 20-80 against us. and the end was usually about 1090, so we didn't move the needle very much. But the point I made, and others made, was 25 years ago when I first went to China, wherever I looked, or wherever I listened, there were loudspeakers on the trains, in the hotel rooms, on the streets, in the shops, in the restaurants. You could not escape this Orwellian cacophony, 24 hours a day, of propaganda and patriotic music. And in that 25 years, since I was a young student backpacker, all that's gone. And the personal level, as consumers, there's been this efflorescence of choice and freedom in China that matches the shift from totalitarianism to authoritarianism. China's neighbors around it, of course, moved from authoritarianism to democracy. But I would argue that the shift from totalitarianism to authoritarianism is a bigger one, and China has made it and is making it. And the reason I say that is to explain why the Chinese audience didn't agree with this. They didn't agree with this because China doesn't have democracy. America has democracy, and they quite rightly see a very strong link between the ability to innovate and the openness, the intellectual openness of a system. What I would submit is we shouldn't think in terms of monolithic categories. China is changing at an extraordinary pace, and if the next 25 years is anything like the last, it is going to be unrecognizable from today. So I think we should think more dynamically about the changes going on there.
I think it's a good thing that China's growing. I think Ed's point earlier about, the 85% of the world that doesn't fall into the classification of the West rising finally to regain their place in the global order and in the sort of line for prosperity is a good thing. It's a just thing. And in fact, if you look at history, like some people don't want to do, but if you do, you find that China was the world's largest economy from the year 0 through the year 1835 or so because they didn't catch on to the Industrial Revolution, and India was the second largest economy because people were the unit of production. Industrial Revolution put technology and capital into the equation. They've caught back up with that, and it's only natural that they are able to keep up. But China's a country in transition. And as Ed notes, I think we need to be careful not to put it into categories. There's a temptation, you hear it a lot in the political system now as we're in a campaign year, to try and say, well, China is the Soviet equivalent. They are our natural enemy. They're the ones who are going to overtake us. China's not the equivalent of the Soviet Union in almost any way. They don't have the global agenda that the Soviet Union had. But most importantly, we have an economy that's interdependent with them. We're like Siamese twins, Siamese giants, joined at our most important organs. If we hurt them, it hurts us. If they hurt us, it hurts them. We need to develop a new kind of a doctrine for dealing with a country like that, a doctrine of interdependence, and we're a long way from that. By the same token, however, the Chinese need to learn how to lead. As recently as 3-4 years ago, when you covered G20 meeting, there was a lot of buzz. Is there really a G2 at the middle of all of this? And, of course, there is, really. But the Chinese didn't want to hear anything about it. They were denying that there was because they didn't feel ready. Since then, they've flexed their muscles a little bit. They've gotten a little bit involved in Iran. They've been a little bit unconstructively involved in Syria. They've been a little bit involved in what's going on in the Eurozone. And while that's good, the Syria example also illustrates that they're not ready for prime time. They don't recognize that they have a responsibility as a leader to the global community. They follow national self-interest in the narrowest of ways possible. And it not only damages their international standing, but it's going to reduce their ability to influence international outcomes in ways that they're going to want to do going forward. So we have to recognize it's a period of transition, but we shouldn't be afraid of China. Rather, we should be afraid of our resistance to these changes and our resistance to looking for the new kind of formulations that we're going to need to deal with them.
Good. Now, both of you have just talked about the political landscape, and we've got a couple of questions on that same general area that I'd like to get your views on. David, maybe we'll start with you, and I'll read both of these questions. Why hasn't increasing inequality of income resulted in a turn to the political left? And also, how can the moderates take back the political agenda? And I think it's a broader question as well about compromise. What does it take to get more compromise and moderation into the political discourse?
Well, first of all, I think, we're in an interesting year. We've had the Occupy movement, we've had the Tea Party movement. I would argue that the Occupy movement, the Tea Party movement are actually sort of opposite sides of the same coin, and would call them the politics of alienation. These are people who don't feel like the system is working for them. Unfortunately, for America, one side is saying the problem lies all with Wall Street. The other side is saying the problem lies all with government. Now, I think there are big problems in Wall Street, and I think there are big problems in government. We'd be better off dealing with them in a constructive way rather than, the Rand Paul formulation. If only government got out of the way, freedom would sweep right in. I was just in East Africa. Government is out of the way. It's not freedom that swept right in. It was anarchy that swept right in. What happens when you get government out of the way is that big players with big shoulders get to take more of the role, and the little guy gets shoved out of the way again. You need equalizing forces. Now, as far as the second half of the question goes, that's what you'd get if you had the rise of the center. But we have a system in which that's almost institutionally impossible. More incumbents get returned to office in the United States than did in the Supreme Soviet. That's not my observation, by the way. That was Ronald Reagan's observation. It's still true. It's about 90%. Well, if incumbents always get returned to office, why? It's because districts are gerrymandered to serve one political party or another. If that's the case, then that means general elections don't matter. So what matters? Primary elections. Well, who dominates in primary elections? Who votes in primary elections? The extreme right and the extreme left. And so what happens is that the wings of the party are the ones picking the candidates. And that's fundamentally broken. However, we've also got a system where the two parties dominate all the laws of getting candidates on the ballot. So getting a third party in, even in a year of America's elect, which is a nice idea, but it's not going to change the system in a dramatic way, getting a third party in is not really an option either. We have to change the system of gerrymandering in this country to get the center back, just like we have to change the campaign finance system so that we are not running elections that require candidates to raise hundreds of millions of dollars to get into office, or we will naturally take the power and give it to check writers. And check writers tend to be people who've got money in their bank and typically are big, big companies.
I mean, you've given, I think, the best and most eloquent answer possible to that question, why don't moderates influence the election more? If I could add to the point you made about, very important point you made about gerrymandering and the stranglehold that the party activists have over the primary process, I think it's worse than that. I think that's a very serious institutional problem. But I think if you look at the Senate, where, of course, you can't gerrymander, and boundaries are the same whatever happens, it is as polarized nowadays as the House. And I think that points to an even more troubling socio-political influence on the polarization of American politics, which is what I mentioned earlier, the Bill Bishop, Charles Murray, the big sorting of Americans into different districts. There's some fascinating statistics in Bill Bishop's book, one of which, and I might get the exact numbers a little bit wrong, one of which is the most, to me, most arresting one of which is in the mid-70s, if you looked at who voted which way in presidential elections, then districts would tend to go 45, 55, Carter Ford, even up to 80, 84. It would be it would be fairly split district by district, except for a few in Alabama and a few in Vermont. Broadly speaking, nowadays the overwhelming preponderance of districts, we're getting 65-35, 70-30. People are dividing themselves, separating themselves. And this means that even if you had open primaries everywhere, even if you had a big shake-up of the way parties select their candidates, that wouldn't necessarily fix the problem. It is to do with Americans themselves as well as their institutions in Washington and their parties. And that's kind of what makes it...
Well, if I may ask you to bring up a point that you made in your article today, civility is part of an issue too. Talk about the filibustering.
Absolutely. I mean, again, the number is arresting, which is up until the 60s. Well, in the 1960s, 8% of all legislation was filibustered, and it's been going gradually up since then. It's now approaching 3/4 of all bills are filibustered. Remember, this isn't in the Constitution, but we're behaving as if it is, as if there's nothing that can be done about it. It could actually be fixed by a simple meeting between Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. But you know, I'll give anybody $100, and if this happens, I'll give them a lot more. I'm more confident it's not going to happen. That meeting in the foreseeable future. But that's a very good point, David.
Okay, well, let me start shifting now to what should we do, because I think the severity of the challenges is fairly clear. One of our student scholars asked about education and said historically education has been an excellent way to escape poverty in the U.S. for individuals to rise into the middle class and beyond. But with the cost of higher education in the U.S., how do you still make that a reality? What would you do in that case? How big an issue do you see that as?
Well, there are a whole range of things that we have to do to fix education in the United States. It's absolutely documented everywhere that providing pre-K education is the single most important thing that you can do in order to ensure performance later on. Secondly, in the course of public education, one thing we could do is not have a debate about whether public education, which led to America's growth, is actually a good thing or not. But we have political candidates out there who are condemning public education, which is, absurd. We have problems in public education in America. The dropout rate is one problem. Another problem is union-dominated system where you can't actually get a national curriculum and use new technologies to stream the best minds back and forth across America as we might be able to do if we did that. I think another problem in terms of education at the higher education level, part of it is the issue that's raised in the question. Part of it is an issue, again, that's raised in Ed's article and regularly by people who are paying attention, which is we have a great college and graduate education system here. People come from around the world to come here, the best and the brightest. If we would give them a visa when they graduated so they could stay here and work, we could actually stimulate growth in our economy. The final point I'd make on education is that the system of education that we use, from the sage on the stage, standing behind the podium, talking to a room full of people, to the way that it's organized in terms of where it happens in your life, was developed in Bologna in the 8th century. Okay? When people worked until they were 35 and they died. So they went to college and they had a 12-year career in one thing, and the pace of change in the world was slow. The notion that somehow a nation can be competitive, educating people to age 21, patting them on the back and sending them out for a career that's going to be 60 years long, because someday your children will go to the Smithsonian and visit the exhibit on retirement. For a career that's 60 years long, where the pace of change is extremely rapid, suggests that we need lifelong education and mechanisms for lifelong education. And the great thing about the United States is we've got the tools to do it as well as anybody in the world. We're just not doing it because the political system is broken in the ways that we were just talking about.
Again, I fully agree, and I think that's more eloquently than I can possibly put it. I think America needs a Marshall Plan for Middle America, for skills, for education. And I think it's one of the disappointments of the last 2-3 years, notwithstanding the very, very difficult political and real-world economic pressures Washington has been subjected to, that we haven't seen focus on community colleges. We haven't seen the focus on upgrading workers' skills and on revitalizing the K-12 system that I think America desperately needs to focus on. But I won't go on because I think you've put the point exceptionally well.
Good. Let me ask a couple other questions again in this spirit of what to do from here. And I'll paraphrase this question, but there's been a fair amount of discussion about the importance of capital markets, government, politicians, etc. Where is the role of individuals and individual responsibility in driving some of the future improvements in society?
David, I think you should...
Oh, thanks. Look, the role of individuals and of families is central, and we're not going to change the system unless every person in this room decides it's their responsibility to change it in some way. And I go out, and I've given a lot of talks like this, and somebody will stand up, what do I do? And the answer is, it almost doesn't matter. Do something. If it's your school board, do it at your school board. If it's your city council, do it at your city council. If it's with your congressman, do it with your congressman. If you can run for office, run. If you can contribute to somebody who's got decent views, contribute to them. If you've got the ability to go and write a letter, post a blog, the point is, most Americans are passive when it comes to this system. They let it happen. They may complain about it around the dinner table. They don't show up to vote. They don't vote in the primaries. And then they say, how come this isn't working? This is you. If you don't make a change, it's not going to happen.
I think so, just to add to that. I think it's very instructive. There have been a series of studies of American civics knowledge and general knowledge done in the last few years that show America's knowledge of public events amongst Americans has declined quite sharply, not just in the last 10, 15 years with the rise of the internet, paradoxically, because that, of course, is a vast trove of information if you use it.
There was at one point a study that showed that American students thought that Chernobyl was Cher's full name.
There's something Freudian in that one, I think. The fact that No Child Left Behind and that a lot of the drives on education are to test only two things, mathematics and English, and don't include other subjects, don't include civics, don't include history, don't include other sciences, is I think something that is perhaps overlooked as skewing the way we're educating our children. And I say we generally, not just because I've lived in America for quite a long time, but because there are similar drives in Britain. There are similar sort of standard testing, obsessional policy drives going on. And the ignorance of the electorate has to be part of the explanation here. We keep passing off the blame to people in public life, but people in public life are the people we deserve to have in public life. I feel that very strongly. In the last generation, and this was a tweet I picked up just earlier, but I checked the article on which the tweet was based, and it rings true with what I've been writing about and what David's been writing about. In the last generation, the rate of increase of spending on higher education in America has been exceeded times 6 by the rate of increase in spending on prisons. The number of Americans under correctional supervision now exceeds the number of people in Stalin's Gulag. This sounds like one of those ridiculous factoids, but it is an incredibly expensive thing that reflects public priorities, because these are the results of ballot initiatives. These aren't intermediated by legislatures. These are direct ballot initiatives in places like California, the 3 strikes referendum, and in Oregon and elsewhere. There are now half of American states have a 3 strikes law. So we have to look in the mirror, I think, in answer to that question. It's a very good question that does imply that answer, but we have to look in the mirror as well.
But if you've got a public debate in a country in which a allegedly credible figure is allowed to argue that we shouldn't teach evolution in the schools because there are other theories out there and we ought to teach all those theories, or that climate change is political science, not real science, then you get what you deserve. If people don't stand up and say, folks, that's bullshit.
David, the next question is for you. You had mentioned earlier in this session, you have to know as a nation what you want to be good at. Questioner here asks, what would your own advice be in the U.S. for what we should be good at?
Look, we've got a chance to be competitive. The next economy is high value-added manufacturing. What I mean by that is manufacturing in which the critical inputs of the past, labor and materials, aren't the most important inputs, but intellectual property is the most important input, whether it's materials science or automated manufacturing or customized interfaces with the public so that you can customize the product, or an interface with a consumer so that you can fix the product from afar. Everything is imbued with information technology, with information, excuse me. We have a system that actually protects that intellectual property. A lot of these other countries that have been eating our lunch in terms of manufacturing don't and won't for a long time. So, if we would focus on our comparative advantages and build on those comparative advantages, there is no reason why you won't see this trend, which is referred to in a lot of articles recently, continue where companies come back here because they're not being extorted for their intellectual property like they are in China. So build that with education, with infrastructure that ensures the flow of information back and forth, by having strong intellectual property laws and standing up to other countries that don't have strong intellectual property laws, by investing in things other than defense. All of you have made a choice, an interesting choice, and I'd like to talk to you about it when we're done. Because you, as voters, have determined that the United States of America should spend the single largest portion of the discretionary money that we've got, what Ed in his piece today calls the budget of tomorrow, on defense spending, instead of infrastructure, education, energy, and the other things we know to spend it on. Why are you doing that?
So in the final couple minutes here, let me ask the same question of both of you, and that is to fast forward 5 or 10 years from now, and let's assume you're betting people and say, what is the U.S. going to look like 5 or 10 years from now? What is the rest of the world going to look like? Where are the relative advantages, et cetera? What will all of this come out to 5 to 10 years from now if you were to put a bet on it? Ed?
At some stage in the next year or two, and it might already be happening, China will slow down. At which point, those who see the glass as half full in the United States will say, we told you so. It happened with the Soviets during the Eisenhower period. We got in a panic about Sputnik. It happened with Japan, with Japanic in the late 80s, and with my compatriot Paul Kennedy calling something too soon, in my view, and perhaps for the wrong reasons. And now here it is happening again. The Chinese are just not able to emulate us. And I think that Chinese slowdown will be engineered. And I think it will be sensible, and I think it will be part of the shift that we're going to see in China from investment to consumption. What worries me is that we're not seeing the concomitant, parallel, and necessary shift from consumption to investment that we need to see in the United States. And as I have to say, I think David's optimistic point about intellectual capital is absolutely right. And if I were to fasten on to a happy ending, it would be America doing all the right things to shore that up through the education system. But I've yet to see really good evidence that this political system is engineering a shift from consumption to investment that America so desperately needs.
If you're a weatherman and you predict that the weather tomorrow is going to be the same as the weather today, you'll be right 85% of the time. And so if you look at a relatively short period like the next 5 or 10 years, I think the thing to expect is it's going to look a lot like the last 5 or 10 years. What is likely to happen is the United States is likely to recover a little bit. If it does, as Ed says, we are going to get complacent. We are not going to fix these issues. And we are going to continue to see the deeper problems in our system, whether it's campaign finance or gerrymandering or problems in the political system or problems in the transfer of power and thus wealth to a tiny fraction of the American people, change. We're not going to fix the core problems. But it's going to happen slowly over the next 5 or 10 years. And I would say if you want to look for fast change in the world, where you're going to see it is in the emerging world, where even if China slows down, Brazil, India, other parts of the emerging world, even stirrings within parts of Africa, are going to continue to attract the majority of new capital and a lot of flow of good brains, because I do think that we are at a transformational moment in terms of the distribution of capital around the world and also of opportunity around the world.
Excellent. So let me just say, first of all, in summary, a very special thank you to David and Ed for thoughtful comments, provocative ones, humor, etc. You guys were both excellent. So thank you for...